makes sense. But what I mean by culture is anything human-made. That's easy. I think I got that from H. Richard Niebuhr decades ago, but I still think it's the best thing I've ever seen. Anything human-made. And let me say a word about tradition. On my view, hardly anyone operates outside of tradition. We all have traditions. But we like to jump on people who are more cultural tradition than the way we're talking about it here today, and say negative things about tradition. But very often they come out of a tradition of their own. I remember I was once in a group of so-called free thinkers who argued that they were free of tradition. And someone in the group was wise enough to remind them that actually their tradition had begun in the 17th century, and they just weren't aware of it. And they were making some of the same arguments that had been being made for some 2 or 3 centuries. So everybody operates out of a tradition. I love Alistair McIntyre's comment about tradition. He says that tradition is a historically extended, it endures over time, socially embodied. It's that of a people. So it's a historically extended, socially embodied argument. Argument. Now, I'll come back on that in a minute. So I found that a very useful way to think about tradition because it is, I don't know a single one that's not argumentative. So that's true. I'd want to say, though, that the only thing about that point, now he's got a longer, more extended comment about that. I won't get into all that, but a question has been raised with McIntyre about focusing so much on argument, on contention within tradition. And while that's surely there, I don't think one can reduce traditions to argument. And others say, you might say argument and conversation, but of course it's more than conversation. Let me say another thing too. A lot of people in the church, a lot of theologians are influenced by Geertz, Geertz, and his book, Interpretation of Culture, where he tends to talk about culture in terms of values. I'm far more influenced, and you'll see that, I think, this afternoon, in this next lecture, but also in the workshops. I don't trust the language of values, mainly because I think it leads to abstraction. And what I like to emphasize in my own work instead are practices. So that you will notice that I will tend to focus around practices. Now, language is a practice, and how you use language. When I talk about the family rhetoric and the way in which appeals to family, use of families in terms of how you would make an argument or how you would be touched or moved. In other words, the art of persuasion and the practices associated with that are centered on family relationships and the rest. There's a sense in which that was what I was trying to suggest today with my comments about family rhetoric. So cultural traditionalists, obviously I'm using it here today in terms of those who would be inhabitants of a tradition that would be more rooted locally. It would tend to be more oral than literate, though I don't mean to suggest these folks can't read and write. I think it would tend to be more characteristic of people without a 4-year college degree, though there are some people who certainly are very much cultural traditionalists who have all the degrees you want to pack in, and I'd like to reflect on it more directly in terms of the practices of it. And I've been trying to suggest that, the whole range of practices around family, the importance of place and the way practices associated with place are really so desperately important. Church, the practices of that, important. Patriotism, practices around that. The often populist economic issues. Now, there's a tendency right now for us to associate populist with very conservative political orientations. But we have also a very strong populist history in our country of those who were on the left and were very populist. My father tells me that my grandfather, Stephen Sample, who lived in East Texas, was a member of a socialist outfit in East Texas, if you can imagine, and he was a farmer there. So that kind of thing. But also and what I'll be doing in the workshops this afternoon is I want to look at a number of practices in terms of cultural traditionalists. So let me put it this way: philosophically, I come out of a school that tends to trust description more than definition. Now, you're going to use definition, but if I'm going to use definition, I want to use it just as a doorway into becoming more descriptive about the practices that a tradition or a people would engage in. Am I saying that plainly enough? In other words, I try to work against abstraction. And I think if you get too oriented around values, values talk, it gets you, like when you say patriotism, you need to break that down into what it means. And let me begin, in a sense, my conversation with you this afternoon by saying this. One of the things that I would suggest to you in working with these cultural traditionalists, first of all, is do a great deal of listening. But I want to slice that, and also watching is the other word. Listen and watch. And here's what I mean. Watch for the practices. And I would keep a little notebook, or well, however you do it, but I'd keep a notebook, and I would be watching what are the practices of the people in my church and in the community, and write those down and become conversant with them. Now, one thing I did like about Geertz was he talked about thick description. And I love the notion of thickly describing, practices you see. For example, if you go to a funeral, pay attention, and some of you will be leading them, of course, but if you go to a funeral, what are the practices? What are the practices in worship? What are the practices before worship? What are people actively doing? And what do they tend to do every week? When you go visit somebody's home, pay attention to practices there. So, and make you a list so that you know. We'll talk about this more in a moment, but I guess I'm going to do this in the workshops. But I think a central practice for most people, really, and there are distinctive forms of them with cultural traditionalists, as I'm using that language. Gatherings. What are the principal gatherings of your congregation, of your community? Do some of you have a rodeo every year? Maybe that doesn't happen in Iowa. Boy, it sure happened in places where I've lived. What about gatherings before worship? What about gatherings at a local coffee house? In the morning, around coffee, around breakfast, and so forth. What kind of gatherings do women engage in typically? What about kids, children, teenagers, and so forth? And then I'd like to say one other piece there. I'm very interested in what I call micro practices. Now, I guess in a way I might almost call it micro practices. A micro practice can be something simply like, let's say, Kathleen Wold. Let me say, is it Wold or Vold? Wold. Kathleen, if I said, "Hi, Kathleen, how are you today?" You said something, you're muted, but you said something like, "I'm fine, I think." And I said, "Good." And you probably said, "How are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm fine too." Now, that's a micro practice at one level. We do it all the time. Now, what if I'd said to you something like, "Hello, Kathleen, how are you today?" You'd have said, why are you prying into my affairs?" You see, that would have disrupted the practice rather seriously, would it not? Have you ever done that to anyone? I suspect not. Have you? Yeah, probably not. But the point is, that practice, you violate that practice and you can be in a heap of trouble. You know what I mean? So we do have now that would be called a micro practice, but there's something I want to get at even more micro than that. And it would be something like this. I was talking to a pastor one day, and I'm thinking about doing a book on, I guess, micro practices. but I said to a pastor, what do you do when you go to somebody's house? I know we don't do that as much anymore, but what do you do when you go to somebody's house? And he gave me an answer that was too big a practice. I said, no, I want something smaller than that. I said, tell me, what happens when they offer you a cup of coffee? And he said, well, I like to walk into the kitchen either while they're fixing it or they're getting it. And what I like to do is read the refrigerator and ask them questions about what's on the refrigerator. Now that's what I'm talking about, those kind of micro practices. I've got this image of competent pastors as having a host of those little bitty practices that they've learned to use, and they use them with great skill. And I'm thinking about writing a book on that. I'll call them the micro practices of ministry, something like that, But just to kind of get at that, what I'm suggesting here is developing that kind of listing of what's going on in your community around practices, something hard and crunchy like that, rather than values. I don't know what you do with values. To me, they're just they're so abstract. You've eventually got to get them into something that's embodied like a practice. But that's a crucial first step. So that listen, watch dimension of working in a rural church. Is that clear? Any comment or question about that? Okay. So let me say one other thing about these cultural traditionalists. They're a mixed bag politically. According to Andrew Levison, he says that about a fourth of them, that's 25.9%, are liberal politically. And then he says about 46.6%, or roughly half, are more ambivalent, neither right nor left, And that a conservative group constitutes about 27.5%. So that's kind of the makeup generally in terms of political commitments, political point of view, and so forth. They tend to be populist on economic issues. In other words, you can have somebody who's free enterprise all the way, but if you've got an issue coming up in that town in which they feel that, say, a fracking move or, say, some CAFO, concentrated animal feeding operation is coming in and doing something bad for the land or the water or for, say, people's property values, they'll fight that like crazy. So that when you talk about them politically, they will tend to vote their identity rather than their interests. And one of the things that means, at least as I look at it, one of the things that means is that often in voting their, and that, a lot of people criticize them for that. They say, well, you're voting your identity, you're voting your culture, you're not voting your interests. Well, who in the world gets to say that one's identity and one's culture has nothing to do with one's politics? You know what I mean? So now all of us have the obligation to make sure our politics and our obligation and our identity and our culture is we place that before God. We place that in God's story for its correction and the rest. So I'm not qualifying that. But I do think that people who have this highly rationalized notion of self-interest that aren't willing to pay attention to people's identity, then they're not engaging a full person. And that's not to say that everything's okay with a person's identity or anything else. Yeah, we're in this. Look, to be in the Christian faith is to be engaged in an operation of maturation in Christ, growing in the Spirit, and the rest. So, not quarreling with that, but to take seriously the way people see their identity. And then, again, picking up on the morning, or earlier in the morning, looking at the question of how are these folks getting their lunch eaten? And they really, really are. Putting that again in story form and the rest, and working with them on it. but working with them on it in the sense of trying to help them in the kind of circumstances and situations that they face. Now, I've seen this done too. Some of you, I hope, really care about racial justice. That's very important to me. What I've discovered is when you're working with cultural traditionalists, when you identify with them in terms of the issues that are significant to them, what I also find is that those issues parallel, often interlace with issues in the black community. And what I try to do is show how those two come together. I remember so well back in the 80s, some of you may not have been born, but back in the 80s, you remember we had the rural crisis at that time, rural farm crisis. It was serious and it was a tough time. A lot of people lost their farms. And I was working here in town with a group, and they asked me if I would go up into northwest Missouri and just go and visit a farmer who was losing his farm. He had that farm, his family had that farm, I believe, for 5 generations, and he was losing it. And he was losing it in great part because of some very bad policy moves by the U.S. government. So I went up and just spent the day with him. I tried not to talk much. I tried mainly just to listen to him, be responsive. And I don't know if you remember, but Jesse Jackson got very active in the farm crisis and was making speeches around the country, farming communities and the rest, defending family farms and so forth. And I didn't set this up. I didn't salt it. I didn't raise, salt it in the sense you'd shoot salt into a wall or something. I basically was just listening. I never shall forget one day that afternoon he said to me, Tex, who I appreciate in all this. And I thought he was going to say Willie Nelson because Willie was singing, for some of the farm operations. And he said, I really appreciate Jesse Jackson. And I said, really, why is that? He said, he gets it. He gets it. He says he's a black man. He's an urban man. But, he cares about us. And he's had our back. He said, I really appreciate it. But this comes from a guy who's losing his farm. And he did lose his farm. But what I'm trying to suggest here is that Jesse Jackson had a way of appreciating what these farmers were up against. Not only identified with it, but spoke for them, spoke with them, and interlaced that, if you will, in terms of racial justice. I think that's the way we deal with this in red state America. I think it's the way we deal with it with cultural traditionalists all across the country. So, there. Well, I guess we're not, right now we're not taking questions. By the way, what time do I stop?